Okay, finally finished the plug wiring for the DC to DC converter. That goes from there to the front of the volt battery pack. And so I believe on the original volt, I could be wrong, but I believe it was like air conditioner, then heater, then charger, or maybe it was heater, air conditioner, charger. These two, we're not going to have air conditioning. So I think what I'm going to use is this one. This one needs to be charging because it's got its own contactor, but I think I'm going to use this middle one for the DC to DC converter. So now I just need to test my connection, make sure I'm getting the right voltage at the right polarity, and we can hook it up and try it. All right, well, I'm really glad I tested it because it was backwards. So I needed to flip it, even though I double checked the documentation about 3 times. I must have flipped up the plug orientation in my head. Anyway, it's always good to test before you hook it up. So now I've got the right polarity coming out of the plug. It matches the documentation for this. So next step is plug it in there and see what we get coming out of the DC-DC converter. Okay, well, here goes the test. So now you can notice there's nothing hooked up to the 12 volt power supply. It's off. There's no wires to it. That was acting like our DC to DC converter before and charging this battery. Now, I guess the nominal voltage that comes out of the DC to DC converter, I thought it was a bit higher. I thought I have to go check the spec again, but I think it was like 14. I can't quite remember. So I didn't want this thing to have like a ton of charge going into it, so I used this to charge it up quite a bit before I did this test earlier. I'm just filming it for you to show you what it does. But I think I may have charged it up a little bit too much, because now when the DC to DC converter comes on, I haven't, yeah, I think it might be less than that, so it's not charging. I don't know if it needs to go, like the spec for this battery on the Amazon page that I bought it from says something about charging range between 14.2 to 14.8. So hopefully that doesn't mean it needs to be in that range all the time. But anyway, so right now the battery is disconnected and the DC to DC converters. If I turn it over to 2, then just the battery will be connected. So you'll see that we get 13.8. That's a little off, so that's probably about 13.9 volts from the battery. Now when I change it from 2 to 1 and 2, it's going to connect both of these coming out. So it's going to connect the DC to DC converter and the battery. Now that shouldn't have any effect right now because the DC to DC converter is off. So when I put it on 1 and 2, now the output of the DC to DC converter, which is that red line, is there, but the key is off. So if I turn it on, you should be able to hear the DC to DC converter get the proper high voltage and click, and a tiny little bit of high frequency noise from it being on. So I'll turn that on. Let's see. Yep. And so I think it's working. So that's great news. That means I got my plugs correct, and I got this thing is the enable line that tells it to come on is working, and it's putting out, you know, voltage to keep the 12 volt running, and I think we're good. It's a good step. All right, Charlie, what day is it?
442.
That's right.
We just filmed this whole thing and then realized we weren't filming, so.
the video was not going. That's right.
Today, we worked on the DC-DC converter and getting these monitors to show our voltage and
That's right. So, in a previous video, we talked about getting it all wired up and getting rid of this power supply. But one of the effects of not having this DC power supply in there is that I could no longer see currents or anything. I just had wires hooked up, and I couldn't see where electricity was flowing. So now we've got a new setup
where I've got two of these monitors on there, and so now I can see current going in and out of the battery and current going out of the DC to DC converter. So right now they're both about even, so there's no charging going to the battery. But what I can do is I've also got this, another thing that we installed is this resettable fuse here. I wound up going with an 80 amp fuse. I don't know, I kind of throughout reading all the specs for this thing and decided on going with 80 amps. I'm going to have much bigger wires once this is in the car. But anyway, and then I've got a 20 amp fuse on the battery because the battery spec says it can do 20 amps continuous. Now, in the car, theoretically, when everything's working, the only current that should be providing is current to close the contactors and then the current going back in the battery to charge it. So there should never really be 20 amps. But if this thing were to fail, you would need to be able to do everything with the battery. So you'd have to turn off, 20 amps is not a lot. You'd have to try to turn off as much as you could in the car so that you could at least get it to the tow truck or get it off to the side of the road. So anyway, these little monitors are cool. They let us see those currents, and what I can do is while it's enabled right now, so we're drawing about 2 amps from the DC to DC converter. You can see if I go to the little simulator and put us in reverse, which will turn on the reverse lights, that'll draw some more current. If I go out of reverse, the current will go back down. But what I can do is I can open this fuse, and then we'll see now that pretty much all the current is coming from the battery, or all the current is coming from the battery, which is cool that I can actually see that. So it's positive current coming out of the battery. If I close this again, you'll see that probably temporarily it'll charge the battery for a little bit. You'll see some negative current, and then pretty quickly the BMS will decide it's full enough and it'll go to 0. Now we're drawing, a little over 2 amps from the DC to DC converter again. So I'm pretty happy with that. I think that lets us see what we want to see. The only other thing I got to do is right now the high voltage for the DC to DC converter, which is running through this cable that I made, runs down here, is using the line. I think the air conditioner might have used that in the Chevy Volt, and that fuse, which is behind that panel, is normally a 40 amp fuse. I need to change that fuse. The specs for that DC to DC converter suggested a 10 amp fuse, and I think my wires are big enough to handle 10 amps. So that's one last thing I need to do, is I need to swap out that fuse with a 10 amp fuse, and I've got one on the way with the help of a forum member from Canada that had some extra parts that he's going to send me. So anyway, I think it's working pretty good, bud. What do you think?
I think it's working great. We're almost there to start my own stuff.
Yep. All right. Good job, bud.